everybody, welcome to Ryan's Room, a show where I find stuff around my apartment and talk to you about them in a sciencey way. In this episode, we've got these two basketball jerseys. So, what are we looking at? This is a jersey that was worn by the NBA's Toronto Raptors in the mid to late 90s. It's their original jersey that they wore when they were first coming into the league. And what I think is kind of interesting about it is the dinosaur that is on the front. Obviously, it's intended to be a raptor, but what you may or may not know is that raptor isn't actually like a specific dinosaur, it's actually like a whole family of dinosaurs. So what I'm hoping to do is figure out exactly what species this dinosaur is. So we're going to be looking at the physical features that we can see right here on the logo and using them to see if we can't narrow down that dinosaur to a specific species. So I bought this one in what would have been, I think, 2012. I was in college at the time. I was doing my bachelor's at University of North Dakota. And I had a roommate, and we used to play NBA 2K together. We were playing NBA 2K12. And we would play the franchise mode. So it's a mode in the game where you take control of a franchise and control it for multiple different seasons. And in our franchise mode we were playing, I was playing as the Toronto Raptors. Kind of just randomly, to be honest. I just kind of picked a team. But we just happened to walk into the Goodwill in Grand Forks during that time and happened to find this on the rack. And like I said, I was playing as the Toronto Raptors at the time. It's in my size. It's actually a Tracy McGrady jersey, who was one of my favorite players when I was a kid. So it was also like less than $10. It just seemed like too good of a deal to pass up, so I scooped it up. This one I got much more recently. So despite owning two Toronto Raptors jerseys, my favorite NBA team was actually the Milwaukee Bucks. And the Milwaukee Bucks played the Toronto Raptors in the playoffs last year, so 2018-2019. And I made a bet with a friend of mine where if the Bucks won that series, then he would have to buy a Bucks jersey. But if the Raptors won, then I had to buy a Raptors jersey. Obviously, I have the jersey, which means that the Raptors won. So yeah, I've only had this one for about a year. So the larger field of science that we're going to be working with today is biology, the study of living things. But if you wanted to narrow it down to a subfield, or maybe even call this just like a practice, what we're going to be dealing with is called cladistics. And what cladistics is this way that scientists sort living things based on how closely related we think they are to one another. And so you can put this on a chart, so you can make what's called a cladogram. And what a cladogram ends up looking like is basically a family tree, except instead of having like little individual people on it, it ends up having entire species, so showing how closely related different species are to one another. And the whole practice of cladistics is basically rooted in one core assumption, and that is that the more physical traits two living things have with one another, the more closely related they probably are.
So generally the smallest group that you're going to be working with when you're talking about cladistics is going to be called a species. And so just to sort of practice how this works, why don't we start out with a species that I know we're all familiar with, the human. And so human obviously is what we would say I am, what you are. But that's not the only thing you could say that we are and have that be true. You could also say that we are apes. And so apes would include not only humans, but also the closest relatives of humans. So this is things like chimpanzees and orangutans and gorillas and gibbons. You could also say that we're primates. And so this is a group that would include all the animals I just mentioned, humans and all the other apes, but also then on top of that include things like monkeys and lemurs. An even bigger group that you could say we're a part of is the mammals. And so this is a group that we share with, again, all the apes and all the primates, but also things like dogs and cats and horses and whales. Anything that's furry and produces milk, basically. Bigger still would be saying that we are vertebrates. And so these are animals that have their skeletons on the inside, have what's called an endoskeleton. And so these are all the mammals, every animal we've mentioned up until now, plus things like fish and birds and reptiles, amphibians, they would all fit in with this group too. And then of course we are animals. And so now we're including everything we've already mentioned, but then also including animals that don't have internal skeletons. So things like jellyfish and worms and insects and spiders. all of these things are animals, even though they don't have internal skeletons like we do. And then finally, the biggest group of all would just be saying that we're alive. And so this would be a group that includes everything that has ever lived on planet Earth. And so this is including all the animals, but also things like plants and fungi and bacteria and viruses. These are all things that are living, and so are all a part of kind of this big global family tree that I've been talking about, even though our last relative that we share probably existed almost 1 billion years ago. So now that we kind of know what we're doing, why don't we go back to the raptor? And for him, we're basically going to do the same thing that we just did with the human, except instead of starting with the small group and working our way to a big group, we're going to go the opposite way. So we're going to start out with the very biggest group, just saying that it is alive, and then we're going to work our way smaller and smaller as far as we can go. And the raptor is, of course, just like our human was, an animal. And we kind of just recognize it as being an animal. That's something that, you can kind of look at it and just tell. But just for the sake of having something we can point to and say this definitively proves that this is an animal, we can take a look at its eyes. And now, eyes are something that not every animal has, like a jellyfish, for example, doesn't have any eyes. But eyes are something that only animals have. You won't ever see a plant with eyes or a fungus with eyes. So the fact that the raptor has eyes puts it very squarely in the animal category. And again, just like the human, the raptor is a vertebrate. And if you remember what a vertebrate is, that is an animal that has an internal skeleton. The hard structural parts that let it stand up are on the inside rather than on the outside. And the thing we can look to on our logo that tells us for sure that it is a vertebrate is that it has teeth. And teeth themselves aren't really a part of the skeleton, but there needs to be a skeleton in order for an animal to have teeth. They need something to sit in, they need something to be attached to. So like for humans, we have a bone in our jaw called a mandible, and the mandible is where the teeth sit. And I would assume that our raptor has a pretty similar setup, even though we can't see his skeleton right now. And before we move on with classifying our raptor, I just want to take a quick sidebar here. You might have noticed that I've been trying really hard not to say the word bones when I've been talking about vertebrates. I've been saying internal skeleton or endoskeleton. And that's because not every vertebrate actually has bones. Most of them do, but there are specifically a few types of fish that don't have any bones at all. Sharks are probably the most famous of these, but one that we actually have locally is the chestnut lamprey. And so fish that don't have bones, like sharks and chestnut lampreys, do still have an internal skeleton, they still have an endoskeleton. Theirs is just made of entirely cartilage. And so cartilage is something that we have in our bodies too. Probably easiest spot to find it is in your ears or on your nose. So like how you can kind of crumple your ear up and it kind of snaps back into shape, a shark's or a lamprey's entire skeleton is made out of that stuff. Also cool thing about lampreys, they're one of the few vertebrates around today that don't have any jaws either. They actually are from a time before the jaw developed. So instead they just have this sort of ring of cartilage that all their teeth are stuck into. Lampreys are super cool. They've been around pretty much in the same form they are now for like 400 million years. They found a life plan and they've stuck to it and it's really worked out for them. Anyway, now that I scared you with a lamprey mouth, let's get back to our raptor. So you basically sort vertebrates into 4 big groups. There's fish, there's reptiles, there's amphibians, and there's mammals. Alright, so let's try and eliminate these groups one at a time. Let's start with fish. So one of the signature things about fish is that they, of course, live underwater. They have gills instead of lungs so that they can breathe underwater instead of on land. Another signature thing that comes with that for fish is that they have fins instead of arms and legs, and these are more useful for them when it comes to moving around in water. So let's take a look at our raptor again and see how he lines up with that. And obviously right away you can tell that our raptor does not have fins, it has legs. Also it's dribbling a basketball, which would not work underwater because the basketball would float. So we can confidently say that the raptor is not a fish. Next, let's take a look at amphibians. And sort of the signature thing about amphibians that separates them away from the rest of the vertebrates is that they're a group that, when they're born, they live in the water. So the adults lay their eggs in the water, and when they hatch, they come out with gills and sort of fins, basically. And they live in the water until they reach adulthood, and then they'll grow legs and come out onto land. Can't really tell if our raptor ever did that. We don't really get a chance to look at what he looked like throughout his life, just based on the logo we've got. But one other lesser known trait about amphibians is that they actually don't have any claws or fingernails, which is kind of unique actually. And that's something we can look to at our logo because it's a good physical trait. And again, just taking a quick look at our logo, we can see that our raptor does in fact have claws on both his hands and his feet. And so that leaves us with two groups left, the reptiles and the mammals. And this one's tricky because a lot of the things that separate reptiles and mammals are things that are either internal, so we wouldn't be able to see them in the logo, or aren't necessarily like real hard rules that are really easy to spot in something as stylized as a logo. So of course, like the signature mammal trait is having fur. But there's a lot of mammals out there that have very little fur or have very fine fur that you wouldn't immediately look at and say, yeah, that's a furry animal, something like a whale. Something like being warm-blooded, like making their own body heat, is something that mammals do, and most reptiles don't. But some reptiles do to some degree, so it's not really a great rule to use for something like this. Plus, we can't really tell based on our logo if our animal is warm or cold-blooded. One thing, though, that we do have as a physical trait that we can look at is the ears. Remember when we were talking about cartilage back with the lamprey, and I told you to grab onto your ear and kind of bend it? That's something that a snake or a lizard couldn't do, because they don't have that big floppy part on the outside of their ear. They just have kind of a hole in the side of their head, and that is their ear. And this is something that is true across the board for reptiles. There's not any reptiles that have that big floppy external part of their ear. And most mammals do have that. Again, of course, there are exceptions. But as far as I know, the only mammals that don't have that are ones that primarily live in water. And so things like whales don't have big floppy parts on the outside of their head to be ears, or dolphins or seals, and that's an adaptation that they have specifically for living underwater. And as we established by the fact that our raptor is dribbling a basketball, we do know that it does not live underwater. So we will call our raptor a reptile. So now we need to find something about our raptor that is unique even among the reptiles, and this is where we're starting to get into some really fine details here. So there's a lot of reptiles out there that have teeth, there's a lot of them out there that have claws, there's a lot that have tails and eyes and things like that. But something that our reptile, our raptor, has that is pretty unique is that it can actually stand upright. So if you think about other reptiles that you know, things like lizards and alligators and snakes, they spend pretty much all their time with their bellies on the ground. Even when they're walking, their arms kind of stick out to their side and their bellies never get more than a little couple inches off the ground. So being able to stand upright and dribble a basketball is kind of a unique thing for a reptile. And the reptiles that are able to do things like that, able to stand upright, are of course the dinosaurs. And the dinosaurs are a group that I'm sure you're familiar with. They were a very prominent group of reptiles on this planet for 200 plus million years. And that being able to stand upright like that was one of the things that made them really successful. It let them get to a lot of areas that other animals that existed at the time just couldn't. So narrowing this down within dinosaurs in particular is kind of tricky, because dinosaurs obviously have been extinct for 60 million years. So that means that what we typically use to sort them into groups is their skeletons, because that's all that we have, which means that a lot of the kind of signature traits of dinosaurs are all internal, and so we're not seeing them on our logo that we're using here. As an example, there's kind of two big groups of dinosaurs. Like the next level below dinosaur are called Ornithischia, the bird hips, because they thought that their hip bones looked like bird hip bones, and Saurischia, the lizard hips, because they thought that their hip bones looked like lizard hips. We can't see the hip bones on our raptor, so that's not something we can really use. So without anything really easy and definitive that we can point to that tells us for sure whether the raptor is in Ornithischia or Saurischia, we have to make sort of an educated guess. And one thing we can look at for that is, again, going back to the teeth that we used before. The raptor has very sharp teeth, which would imply that our raptor is a meat eater. And despite having kind of a fierce reputation, there's actually not very many dinosaurs that eat meat, and almost all of them belong to a group called the theropods, which are a type of Saurischian dinosaur. So I think we'll move forward assuming that our raptor is in Saurischia and most likely a theropod. And so within Saurischia, there are two different groups of dinosaurs. There are the theropods that I just mentioned, which is home to things like Tyrannosaurus rex, probably the most famous theropod. But there's another group in there called the sauropods, which is home to all of the big long neck dinosaurs. And generally the way you would sort those two groups is the sauropods are the ones that walk on 4 legs, and the theropods are the ones that walk on 2 legs. Obviously, our raptor is walking on 2 legs, so again, we can probably put him in the theropods. So our next big clue as far as placing our raptor is on the foot. So most theropods walked around with 3 toes on the ground. Our raptor actually is walking around with only 2 toes touching the ground, though, and you can see he's holding that 3rd toe up off the ground, and the claw is actually pointed upwards. This would be called a sickle claw, and this is something that one group called the dromaeosaurs would use when hunting. So that claw would be what they would use to make the sort of final killing blow on their prey. And so having that sickle claw puts it into the dromaeosaurs. And as far as just using the physical traits of the raptor, I think this is about as far as I can go. Getting it down to what we would call the family level is what the dromaeosaurs would be. We would call that a family. But there are actually a couple more tricks that I can pull out here and maybe narrow it down a little more. So, just knowing my history of the NBA and of the Toronto Raptors, I know that they were founded in the mid-90s sometime. And so, presumably, if it was modeled after a specific dinosaur, it wouldn't be one that was unknown to science at that time. And that actually eliminates a lot of the dromaeosaurs. There's a lot of dromaeosaurs that have been discovered or described just within the last 20 years or so. And so if we assume that this is one that was named before 1995, that really narrows it down to either a velociraptor, a Utah raptor, or a Deinonychus. And they did also give us one last clue in the logo, and that's the basketball. If we assume that the basketball that the Toronto Raptor is dribbling is a regulation-sized NBA basketball, it should be about 9.5 inches in diameter, 9.5 inches at its widest point. And so if we stack a few of those basketballs up next to the Raptor, we can see that he is somewhere between 3 and 4 basketballs tall. He's kind of hunched over, so we'll give him the benefit of the doubt and say if he was standing up straight, he'd be about 36 inches tall, about 3 feet tall. 3 feet tall is too big to be a velociraptor. Velociraptors are pretty close to the same size as like a house cat. And it's too small to be a Utah raptor. Utah raptors are pretty close in size to a human, somewhere between like 5 and 6 feet tall. But it actually pretty much matches up exactly right with the height of a Deinonychus. So I think we can say, with relative confidence, that the Toronto Raptor is meant to be based on a Deinonychus. And so, one last obvious thing as we're looking at our artist's depiction of a Deinonychus here, you'll probably notice that our Deinonychus has feathers. And that's something that, at the time that the original Toronto Raptors logo was being made, was probably something that scientists were probably thinking was true, but probably hadn't quite made its way out to the general public in a big way yet. So at the time, most dinosaurs were still being drawn kind of more lizardy, more scaly looking. But, like I said, in modern understanding, we sort of know that a lot of these kind of raptor-y dinosaurs had feathers and ultimately become modern birds. So, rather than looking like the raptor we see in the logo, a more accurate depiction would probably look a little bit more like this.
And so, just as one last postscript before we wrap up here, I thought it'd be interesting to see if the Toronto Raptors have ever put out any official information on what the raptor on the jersey is meant to be. And it turns out that the Raptor is actually based off of a velociraptor from the Jurassic Park movie. And the Jurassic Park movie is based off of the Michael Crichton book by the same name, which similarly used velociraptors in the same role that they're used in the movie. But the thing about those velociraptors is that they are actually based off of Deinonychus. And Michael Crichton just changed the name because he thought it was a cooler name that people would like more. The book was a huge success, the movie was a huge success, we got an NBA franchise named after it, so hard to say he was wrong on that. So I'm going to call that a win though. I'm going to say we got that right. I'm going to say that the Raptor is actually meant to be a Deinonychus, and I called that correctly, even though the name associated with it is not Deinonychus. But anyway, thank you all for watching, guys. Just as kind of a editing logistical note here, this video is going to be going up on our YouTube channel, and this has been a much more time and labor-intensive video to make than any of the other ones that we put up on there before. So I'm really hoping it does well so we can rationalize making more of them. I've got a lot more stuff laying around my apartment that I would love to show you guys. So yeah, if you want to see more of this stuff, like, subscribe, all that, to the Headwaters Science Center's YouTube channel. Thank you, guys.